Business Logic Services, also known as BLS, are the logic execution engines of SAP MII, which you can use to develop executable business logic for data processing, system integration, graphical analytics, chart generation, file I/O, alert generation, key performance indicator update, and more. BLS are provided by transactions, which are graphically modeled executable programs developed in the SAP MII workbench. BLS transactions are stored as XML in SAP MII and are interpreted and executed by the BLS engine at runtime. You can execute any BLS transaction with a display template or as XML, JSON, OData models in SAP UI5 via execute query from a web page. You can also execute BLS transactions as an HTTP service or SOAP web service from an external system. Finally, you can execute the BLS transactions from the SAP MII workbench and display the output in a pop-up window there. This last option is mainly used for unit testing and debugging purposes. You can create a new BLS transaction from the SAP MII workbench via this menu path. Any BLS transaction can have multiple input and output parameters, as defined in the BLS transaction editor in the SAP MII workbench. You need to assign each output and input with a data type from the list that is supported by BLS. You can define the input and output parameters of a BLS transaction by the transaction properties, which you can access via this menu path, or in the Transaction Configuration tab in the bottom left pane of the workbench, as shown here. Opening the Transaction Properties menu displays the input and output parameters defined for that transaction in a pop-up window. You can add a new transaction property by clicking the Add button, which opens another pop-up window to specify the property name, optional description, data type, and optional minimum, maximum, and default values. To specify a parameter as an output parameter of the transaction, you need to check the Output Parameter checkbox while defining the property. If the box isn't checked, the parameter is considered to be an input parameter for the transaction. The data type of any transaction parameter can be any one of the following. Although the other data types are standard W3C data types, an XML data type in an SAP MII BLS transaction specifies an XML document. You can define the XML structure at design time by specifying the XML in the value field. Otherwise, you can define the structure of the XML data type parameter by using reference documents. The transaction properties already defined are displayed in the main property detail pop-up window with the name, description, input-output flag, and a graphical icon to signify the corresponding data type, as shown in this figure. You can define and use local properties of BLS transaction in the same way as transaction properties. The only difference between the two is those local properties can only be accessed and used inside the BLS transaction and are not visible from the calling application. These are analogous to local variables in common programming languages. You can define the local properties in the same Transaction Configuration tab, in the bottom left corner of the workbench, or in the toolbar menu via this path. Any BLS transaction is made up of one or more sequences, which are the containers or logical groupings of action blocks. An action block is a logical unit in the BLS transaction that performs a particular action, such as creating or parsing an XML document, looping through a repeating node of an XML document, assigning a variable value, executing a remote function call or web service, executing a query, and so on. Each BLS transaction must have at least one sequence created by default that is called the root sequence, which cannot be deleted. BLS transactions are modeled graphically in the transaction editor using the action blocks, which you can drag and drop into the main window inside a sequence. You can add sequences below or above one another. You can add any number of sequences below a sequence at the same level, but only a single sequence at the same level above a sequence. You can add a sequence above another sequence by selecting a sequence and selecting the Insert Sequence option from the context menu, and below a sequence by selecting the Add Sequence menu option. The sequences you add below get added from left to right. The order of execution in a BLS transaction is always from left to right and then top to bottom. A sample BLS transaction is shown in design time, where the outer rectangles are the sequences. The action blocks, which are the inner rectangles with a name and an icon on them, are placed inside the sequences. You can add multiple action blocks in a single sequence, with the exception of a few actions blocks, such as conditional or repeater. Action blocks that are present in the same sequence get executed from left to right. The numbers are added beside the sequences to explain the sequence of flow in a BLS transaction. Some sequences are marked with the same numbers because those sequences are present below a sequence containing a conditional logic action block that decides at runtime to which child sequence the control will flow. Each sequence must have a name. A description is optional. The name is generated by default and can be changed in the sequence properties configuration. The core building blocks of BLS transactions are predefined reusable action blocks that provide built-in functionality for different logic, data processing, connectivity features, and more. They can be used to define a program structure and are provided for a number of functions. These include executing data queries, RFCs, or BOPs from SAP systems, running web services and OData services, sending SOAP and HTTP messages to SAP PII or external systems, sending and reading emails, performing statistical quality control and statistical process control analysis, defining flow logic, and XML parsing and manipulation. The action blocks are categorized according to the functionality they offer and are present in the Actions Configuration tab in the bottom left corner of the workbench, which you can add to sequences via drag and drop or double-clicking. Each action block added in a sequence must have a name. A description is optional, which you can change from the action block configurations. Action blocks have two configuration modes: object configuration and link configuration. You can invoke these two configuration modes by double-clicking an action block added to a sequence or by selecting the corresponding menu option from the context menu on that action block. Each action block has different sets of properties or attributes based on the functionality they provide, to which you can assign or read values. Using object configuration, you can configure most of the properties of the action blocks with fixed values at design time. Using link configuration, you can define the data mapping of the action block's attributes. You must perform the link configuration in the link editor, where you can read or manipulate the values of the attributes of the action blocks. You can also set the configuration properties of the action blocks with dynamic values or variables, which will be replaced by the actual values at runtime, using the link configuration. You can access the object configuration or link configuration of an action block by double-clicking it or by right-clicking when placed inside a sequence in the BLS transaction. The link editor screen has two tabs, incoming and outgoing. The configuration in the incoming tab is evaluated before the action block is executed, and the configuration in the outgoing tab is evaluated after the execution of the action block. In other words, the incoming configuration tab provides the input parameters of the action block whose values can be configured there, whereas the outgoing configuration tab provides the output parameters of the action block, which can be read from other subsequent action blocks. In the incoming tab, the selected action block appears at the right side of the window as the target. All the action blocks that are present before the selected one appear on the left as the source. In the outgoing tab, all action blocks present before the selected action block along with that one appear on both sides of the editor, but only the writable or configurable properties appear under their corresponding action blocks on the right. Both read-only and configurable properties appear under their corresponding actions on the left. Note that links defined in the outgoing tab of an action block are skipped in the case of action block execution failure. Therefore, you should not use the outgoing links section to map properties of action blocks other than the current one. To map the attributes from a previous action block or transaction and local properties to the attributes of the current action block, you can drag and drop the attribute from the left to the right, or you can select the source action block's attribute on the left and double-click the target attribute on the right to create a simple mapping or link. You can also define conditional or complex mapping by using the expression editor at the bottom of the link editor. Any expression can be written in the expression editor using the functions available in the functions drop-down list. Complex expressions can involve string operations, concat, substring, etc., or numeric calculations, addition, subtraction, log, square root, etc., formatting, date functions, hexadecimal color codes, and so on. Clicking the Evaluate button opens a screen with the result of the expression you defined, or an error if the expression is incorrect. To add a new mapping, click the Add button, and to update an existing mapping, click the Update button. You can delete an existing mapping by clicking the Delete button. Always select the target action block's property at the right to add, update, or delete its link. You can maintain the runtime sequence of the mapping by moving a selected mapping row in the grid up or down. To add nested expressions, i.e., expressions within other expressions or variables within an expression, use the Dynamic Link option to select a source attribute. This adds that attribute name enclosed within $, which signifies that at runtime the attribute value is a variable name or an XPath expression that has to be evaluated. Clicking the Property Value button to select a source attribute adds the current value of the attribute to the expression editor. After writing an expression in the expression editor, always remember to click the Add or Update button to add the new or changed mapping expression to the target attribute. The link editor is shown in this figure. Different link types are available as radio buttons in the link editor. These specify the different types of mappings, as follows. Simple mapping between non-XML attributes such as string, integer, and so on, where the target attribute gets the same value as the source. Mapping between two XML type attributes, where the target attribute gets the source XML document assigned to it, overriding the current XML, if any. Mapping between two XML type elements, where the target attribute gets the source attribute's XML document assigned to it as a child element under the existing root element of the existing XML. Mapping between two XML attributes, where the source XML documents get added to the target XML document as a sibling. This should be added by selecting a node below the root node of the target XML. Mapping between two XML attributes, where the target XML element and its children are replaced with the source node and its children. This should be added by selecting an element of the target XML. Mapping to remove the target node and its children. This should be done when an XML attribute value has to be set to null. For many action blocks, object configuration and link configuration allow the same properties to be configured. In general, you should use object configuration to set the property values of the action block with fixed values at design time. You should use the link configuration to map variables to the action block's properties that can provide dynamic values at runtime. Link configuration always overrides the object configuration for a property of the action block. Remember, you must use the link configuration to read any property value of an action block or transaction from its subsequent action block. Note that most of the action blocks have a Boolean output property called success, which you can use to determine whether or not the action is successfully executed. You can execute a BLS transaction for testing purposes from the workbench via this menu path. When you are executing the default trace and debug, output information is displayed in a pop-up window. The Execute Without Trace option does not display the default trace. You need to use the BLS transactions as the core logic components of the composite applications developed on SAP MII. You can model all necessary data processing logic, system integration by data queries, and RFC or web service calls. You also can read or update buffered messages or files from file systems, generate visualization components as animated graphics or chart images, and so on. BLS transactions are executed from web pages such as transaction dashboards or provide the necessary data to the charts for analysis dashboards, and even can be executed as background jobs using schedulers to execute business logic.